Good afternoon and welcome to ARC's Literacy Coffee and Conversation series. I'm at a hotel, so I have a very plain coffee cup today. I'm Amelia Larson, and I serve as the EVP of Innovations and Academic Partnerships at American Reading Company. ARC is an organization founded by and run by educators in pursuit of love, literacy, and liberty. Our work is designed to create the types of schools where all students are served well and thrive. We draw specific attention to the needs of students from historically marginalized and underserved groups by creating a sense of belonging and safety and engaging them in high levels of literacy work that honors their intellect, their language, their culture, and their communities. I would like to welcome our speakers back, starting with our esteemed board member, Dr. Jim Cummins. He is a professor emeritus with the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education at the University of Toronto, Canada. And our esteemed friend, Dr. Claude Goldenberg, is a Nomelini and Olivier Professor of Education Emeritus in the Graduate School of Education at Stanford University. Thank you so much for joining us again. We are just delighted to have you back to continue this conversation on pursuing clarity in the science of reading instruction. I don't know if you realize this, but we have started this back in August. We have discussed so many issues, overall definitions, positions, broad areas of agreement. How can we bring people together that need to be involved in the solution? How do we avoid doing harm? So in starting today, I'm going to ask you, Dr. Cummins, to comment first. When we entered this conversation, we have kept it going. What are your takeaways from this experience and takeaways that you want others to share from this experience?
Thanks, Amelia, and thanks to everybody who's here. I'm delighted to be part of this conversation. As Amelia mentioned, Claude and I, and with occasionally some other panelists, have been talking about these issues for the best part of a year. And the focus has been always on trying to identify the common ground that we've got. And from my point of view, I've been quite disturbed when I've read a lot of journalistic articles relating to the science of reading, because a significant proportion of those articles set up an either-or dichotomy between science of reading and balanced literacy, good guys, bad guys. And when I look at the research, I don't see that either-or orientation being reflected in the research that I'm familiar with, the research that has been published, for example, in 2 special issues of Reading Research Quarterly. They published about 50 articles dealing with science of reading issues. And what emerged for me from the research perspective is that even though there's differences in emphasis, there's a lot of common ground. It's a both and orientation that emerges. And I drew up a little diagram to try and express what I see as the common ground, or a starting point for common ground in relation to these issues. This is an attempt at a big picture framework where if we could get to a state where we agree on what's in this diagram, then I think a lot of the details could be filled in. I'm playing with the notion of a simple view of reading, which has been a common starting point for much of this discussion. And I'm labeling this a simple view of reading instruction, or a simple view of the science of reading instruction, because all of us, I think, are committed to following what the research is saying, following the science. And my argument in this diagram, or that I try to express in this diagram, is that if we're going to talk about the science of reading, we've got to include all the science. And there are 2 big gaping gaps that I see in the way these issues have been framed, particularly in journalistic articles. And the first of these is the lack of attention to literacy socialization issues in the preschool years. There's a huge amount of research that I think all of the researchers are familiar with. I don't know of any researcher who disagrees with this, that the exposure to print in the preschool years, parents reading to children, parents drawing kids' attention to aspects of the print in books, drawing attention to letters of the alphabet as they're reading. All of this exposure to print and interaction and engagement around print is a major predictor of how well children are going to read. It's also differentiated according to socioeconomic status. Rich kids from middle-class backgrounds have lots of exposure to books. They're saturated with books in the early years. Kids whose families are living in poverty, trying to put food on the table on a day-to-day basis, don't have the money to buy, or their families don't have the money to buy books. There's much less print exposure going on, and this makes a difference. And so when we talk about preventing reading difficulties and we ignore what's happening at the preschool years, we're missing out huge opportunities to make a difference. And there's a lot of research highlighting the impact that increasing the exposure to books, the exposure to read alouds in early childhood settings, providing books to families, focusing on maximizing the extent to which kids get exposure to print and literacy socialization can make a huge difference. So that's one aspect that has been left out of certainly a lot of the journalistic accounts and often some of the research accounts also. The other aspect that is rarely mentioned is that in addition to the importance of focusing on developing students' awareness of how language works, how print works, all of the things that I've included over here in terms of language and literacy awareness, their phonological awareness, their knowledge of phonics, all of those things are really important as foundational skills in the early years of instruction. But equally important is the kind of focus that expands students' vocabulary knowledge, expands their knowledge of how print works, which they get primarily from books. There's a lot of research highlighting the fact that even in very basic children's picture books, the kind of language that is in that book, the vocabulary, for example, is much more complex, much less frequent than the conversation that adults have with children or even adults have with each other. And so when we look at expansion of vocabulary, which is a major factor in terms of not just comprehension, but also decoding skills, we need to focus on the research that highlights the strong causal effect of literacy engagement on students' reading comprehension development and language development generally. And again, this is rarely acknowledged in much of the journalistic literature that often sets up an either-or orientation between teaching phonics and other foundational skills, and then balanced literacy, which is whole language based and doesn't teach phonics. If you go back to the National Reading Panel and look at their treatment of these issues, they highlight the fact that there should be a balance between a focus on systematic phonics instruction and providing a rich literacy environment for children. They talk about a balance between these two orientations. And so we're looking at a both and orientation. So we can't talk about a science of reading instruction without highlighting not just the cognitive issues or the ability issues that we look at in terms of individual cognition, but also the social opportunities that children experience to gain access to print, both at the preschool level and in the early years of schooling.
Thank you, Jim, for setting us up. And I'm going to turn to you, Claude, to comment on your experience in responding to Jim.
Well, thanks, Amelia, and thanks to Jim. I mean, it's really been an honor and a pleasure to participate in this with you. And Amelia, thank you for organizing and mediating this, and thanks to Jim for participating. So I'm going to try to push the model that you've encouraged us to use, which is yes and Jim has spoken of this, and I think we need to take that kind of stance. So I'm going to try to illustrate that. And I hope, Jim, you won't think that I'm perverting the conjunction in my use of and, but we can discuss that. So let me start off by saying that, I agree with just about everything that Jim said. Just one little note. I mean, one of the issues we have is how we talk about these issues. I mean, the issues are, how should I say, communicative as well as substantive. And I just want to use one example. I mean, the term balanced kind of drives me crazy because Jim is absolutely right. When the National Reading Panel used the term balanced programs over 20 years ago, they meant exactly what Jim said they meant. You need foundational skills instruction, but you also need a rich, language-rich program with vocabulary, background knowledge, read alouds. That's what balance meant then. Somehow, in the intervening years, the term balance has been hijacked to mean something different, which means something like 3Qing, which you teach children to read by looking at different cues. You look at a letter, you look at the pictures, you look at the context, you think about what would make sense. That's the operationalization of balanced literacy that has come to be, how should I say, more popularized. And that is a terrible way to teach reading. If you're talking about balanced in the sense that Jim talked about it, I'm on board, 100%. Yes, full stop. If you're talking about balanced as looking at different cues on the page and deciding which ones you're going to pay attention to in order to read words, then that is a terrible way to teach reading. So that's just one example of how we get tripped up with words that are operationalized differently. And we really are talking past each other when you're using the same words, but meaning something very, very different. So let me go to Jim's comments and his figure, which I really do appreciate. I mean, I think for the most part, what's in this, I mean, for any part, what's in this diagram is really beyond dispute. We want language and literacy engagement. We want language and literacy development. I mean, that's what we're after. That's what we're here for. So there's really nothing to disagree with. And a K-12 instructional focus, well, that's really what all the arguments are about. What should we focus on in K-12? So we agree that one way or another, by design or default, there is some K-12 instructional focus. So what I want to focus on is preschool language and literacy socialization, which Jim has rightly emphasized in all of our webinars, in all our many communications in between the webinars. And I agree, it's been too marginal, even though there's a very rich literature that we should draw on. And because of this marginalization, I'm happy to point out something that may be news to a lot of our listeners, that there's a recent publication, Handbook of the Science of Early Literacy, edited by Sonia Cabell, Susan Newman, and Nicole Patenteri, and published by Guilford. Now, I mean, I have no stock in Guilford Industries, so there's no kickback or anything. I think it's going to be a tremendous contribution to the field, and I think helps illustrate exactly what Jim has been talking about for these past few months. Early childhood experiences most certainly matter. And in the spirit of my yes and stance, yes, I agree with this. And I have a few things to add. 4, to be exact, which I'll try to mention briefly, and then we could decide which ones are worth pursuing at length. Number 1, so there's no question that preschool language and literacy socialization matters. And there's a very big question as to what extent preschools really can help provide to children who currently do not enjoy them the sorts of language and literacy experiences that Jim holds up. Now, to my knowledge, nowhere in the research literature, and I'd be delighted to be proven wrong, nowhere in the research literature has it been demonstrated that we know how to accomplish this. The research that Jim is talking about is basically correlational. We know that if your illiteracy socialization experiences are up here, your chance of being successful as a literate individual are also up here. There's no guarantee, but they're correlated. But it's one thing to talk about correlation, and it's another thing as a matter of practice and policy to make things happen that don't sort of happen on their own. And as far as I know, we don't know. We don't have the knowledge or the wherewithal to accomplish, certainly not at any scale, to provide to children who would not otherwise have these experiences, the kind of experiences I think everyone would agree are highly beneficial for literacy development. So that's number 1. Number 2, again, yes, language and literacy socialization are extremely important. And it is also very important to recognize that even if we did have the knowledge and the wherewithal to create these kinds of experiences for children who don't normally or under normal circumstances have them, and we don't have that knowledge and wherewithal, it would not cure all of our reading challenges. And then more generally, even children who don't have great difficulty, we know there will be children who have great difficulty reading, even if they have these early socialization experiences. But then, as I was saying, more generally, we know that students, even if they don't have great difficulty, most students will benefit from some amount of direct teaching, direct experience, direct tuition, shall we say, in how to figure out how written language works. You know, some will need a little bit of this direct teaching, some will need a lot. Most of the rest of us are, you know, somewhere in between. And I assume, I hope that something about this would be in the space that Jim has defined as K-12 instructional focus. At some point, I think need to talk about that. And there's much more to say here, but I'm going to hold off on that for now. Number three, my third and, is that, and the reason why all students will benefit from at least some sort of direct teaching on the sound symbol system is that, and that individuals, and that some individuals will need a lot more than just some, is that written language is received and processed by the human brain differently than oral language. We are born with the brain circuitry to understand and to produce speech, oral language. Assuming there's no anomaly, learning how to understand and produce oral language is just part of our human evolution. It's been with us starting about past 300,000 years. Print, written language, appeared a brief 5,000 years ago. And the brain circuitry that allows us to take in, to process, to make sense, to produce written language, that brain circuitry has to be constructed by direct experience that includes being shown or being taught how oral language and written language hook up, or bind is the word that's used in the neurolinguistic literature that I have read, and I would encourage others to read as well. I have several articles in the resources for further consideration that you might want to take a look at and read. Some of this is pretty tough reading. I had to really kind of puzzle through it to figure out what I'm not a neuroscientist, full disclosure, but I've worked through them. I think I've learned something from them. If you have trouble negotiating them, I've made some PowerPoints to make them a little more transparent. So please feel free to email me and I'll send them to you. So that Jim rightly emphasizes language and literacy socialization, then awareness and engagement and development. And I would add to that we need to be aware of, and we need to understand that oral language and written language are of course highly related, but they're not the same thing. They're acquired differently, and they require different types of experiences and teaching. And my fourth and final and is that we need to self-monitor in our field and challenge misinformation and untruths that only muddle what is already a complex and challenging field. Now, I can give you several examples, and I've alluded to this several times, but we have a lot of misinformation floating around in our field from various sides. Some things that are simply preposterous are stated. For example, some people say the science of reading is an English-centric program. That is a preposterous statement in several ways. And we can get into these, but that's the fourth and, that if we really want to continue this progress, we must self-monitor and be on the lookout for things that are just creating more muddle and more confusion for teachers. So those are my yes ands. Jim, Amelia, I'm done.
Well, what I want to model for people is that if you are engaging in these types of dialogue, and they are prolonged dialogues, I think precision, patience, listening, sharing different perspectives is absolutely critical. And just know that, like, Rome was not built in a day, but they worked at it every day. So you cannot back away from it. I do want to highlight, though, based on what Claude said, that it is important for us to include this literacy socialization, not only early on, but overall, right? So there are more things that we're finding out. effects of parents reading to young children in their brains. They are able to see the parts of the brain that are active during read alouds. Talking to children matter, dialogic reading, picture book reading really matters, reading aloud really matters. So there are many, many things that are not discussed that both Claude and Jim brought together. But we also wanted to tell you a little bit about the national conversations that are going on. For example, just last month, the first Reading League Summit around multilingual learners took place in Las Vegas. There were about 500 people there. And they really fulfilled their promise of bringing different perspectives together. And they truly modeled what it's like to build consensus, build a way forward from a place of trust. And they showed that through the conversations, they found multiple areas of alignment, like Jim and Claude did. But there's still many areas where there's ongoing conversations. And Claude, your experience in California, can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, we recently completed a year-long effort to try and find some common ground among different, I don't know, literacy leaders, policy advocates for different groups of children. Some were academics, some were people who work with foundations. Some people were simply informed and caring citizens who want to see children receive better reading education. Some of the people who participated were from the Decoding Dyslexia, a very important advocacy group for kids who either have dyslexia or at risk for dyslexia now or in the future. We also had a very prominent, highly nationally respected advocate for African-American kids, a member of the NAACP, a man who I suspect most people know, Kareem Weaver. And we had a lot of advocates for English learners, individuals who feel that the so-called science of reading is not really in the best interest of English learners and emergent bilingual for various reasons. So starting back, and it's been over a year, we started having some conversations and interviews with some colleagues. This was something that was organized by Pivot Learning, trying to get a sense from them of what the big issues were in reading education and reading policy. And then from those conversations, we sort of analyzed. My colleague Eduardo Munoz at Cal State San Jose took the lead, methodologically. We took those interviews and tried to boil them down to some key points. Then we had a series of focus groups. To your point, Amelia, this wasn't built in a day. This was literally, a year-long process. We had a series of focus groups to see what we missed from the interviews, and then tried to boil those down. And then we had a series of a convening meeting in person. Everything was virtual except for a convening meeting we had back in September. And we identified 3 key areas. There were several areas that were put on the table, but we decided we can't handle everything. So there were 3 key areas that we decided to really focus on and see if we couldn't come to some agreement on. One was English learners, emergent bilingual, multilingual learners. What should the state of play be for them? And more generally, dual language education, because we came to the conclusion that all children should have an opportunity to become bilingual. I mean, that was something there was literally no disagreement on. I mean, you talk about common ground, there was unanimity in the advantage of bilingualism. We come at it from different directions, but that was one area, multilingual learners and just the bilingual issue. Secondly, the role of the role of foundational skills. What are they, and what role should they play in the education of literacy education? How systematic and explicit should they be? That's been a tremendous source of disagreement and controversy. And then finally, the issue of early identification, universal early screening for early reading difficulties. That's been very controversial as well. One of the things that's very controversial is, do we use the word dyslexia in legislation or in policy? And it turns out it's very misleading, because you can't diagnose dyslexia, as some people think, back in kindergarten or first grade. You can't diagnose dyslexia until children have had adequate opportunities to be taught, to learn. And so we had to work around those semantic issues, semantic and conceptual. It wasn't just semantic. And finally, we came to the conclusion that early identification for early reading difficulties with sufficient guardrails, so you don't confound language proficiency with reading difficulties, with phonological issues, with short-term memory issues. Those things have got to be disambiguated. You have to be clear what the red flags actually mean. You have to be clear on how to interpret the data, and that something useful will be done with the data, rather than just sort of addressing, adding more assessments to the school day. So those three areas, we published a convening paper.
And we are sharing that document. That document
Yes.
is very interesting. We're sharing it with you because it talks about the process that they went through to bring people with multiple perspectives. But Jim, can you talk a little bit about this? Because there is a lack of trust. Many people feel like when people are talking about the science of reading, there's a focus on dyslexia, but there's not necessarily a focus on multilingual learners. How do we help people see themselves in the conversation? What has been your experience with that?
If we look at what the research is saying, there's a huge amount of agreement among the researchers. If you, again, go back to those 50 articles in Reading Research Quarterly, there's differences in emphasis, but not much difference in substance. I think we've got to distinguish between the science of reading movement, which would include all of the media articles in there, the journalistic articles, the policies that have been enacted, and researchers that identify with that label. But the science of reading movement doesn't necessarily reflect the science of reading research. And the science of reading research, for example, I think is totally consistent with, and as Claude said, I think most researchers would have very little difficulty with the big picture diagram that I put up there, where we've got to take account not just of what's inside students' heads, the cognitive focus. We've got to move beyond just an individual cognitive focus on the cause of reading to look at opportunities to learn. And so when we talk about screening for dyslexia, there's a huge confusion between dyslexia as a neurological condition that may affect, say, between 2 and 5% of students, and the 20 or so, 20 plus percentage of students in whatever jurisdiction who might experience reading difficulties. That difference of at least 15% between dyslexics who have a neurological sourced difficulty in processing print, and students who have reading difficulties more generally, can only be addressed by looking at the social conditions under which students have access to print. And unless we do that, unless we intervene in those social conditions, then we're not going to address the issue. So if we look at the objection to this, and this goes back to a really interesting interchange between Catherine Snow, who is the principal author of the 1998 report, Preventing Reading Difficulties in Young Children, and James Paul Gee, a researcher who wrote a critique of that report. Gee's point was that, hey, the social conditions are more strongly related to reading success or failure than individual cognitive abilities like phonological awareness or other cognitive variables. And so if we ignore those social conditions, we're missing out on a lot of what we need to do to ameliorate kids' opportunity to learn. Catherine Snow responded to this by saying, hey, the schools can't do anything very much about social conditions, so let's focus on what we can do, which is help kids with reading instruction. But the reality is schools can do a huge amount to ameliorate one aspect of those social conditions, and that's the access to print. And so if schools are aware of the fact that many of the kids that are coming in from low-income backgrounds have had very little access to print and are not in the same place as kids from more affluent background who've been socialized in a print-rich environment for 5 years, then they're not going to focus in on providing that rich literacy environment. And so when we look at those issues, schools can do a lot to ameliorate some of the socioeconomic causes of underachievement. And that applies to multilingual students as well as students from English-home backgrounds who are low income.
But what I'm hearing is that there are things that we can do early on that we have control over, but nothing is simplistic. We need to ensure that we have access, literacy, socialization, access to text, and we also need to make sure we provide the best access to high quality instruction that includes foundational skills, includes knowledge building, access to complex texts. So nothing is simplistic. There is a good question, though, related to what is the difference between the science of reading and the science of reading movement? And I would invite you to look at the Mark Seidenberg's blogs. He's really tackling this issue between the difference between the science in the science of reading and the science of reading movement, which is pretty interesting. But there is also overlap. It's not completely different, right? But there are preferences sometimes that are presented as convergence of research, and they're not exactly the same thing, which leads me to the next topic. With all of these agreements, disagreements, areas that we have control over, what recommendations would you have for states that are implementing policies related to the science of reading? Claude, I'm going to start with you.
Well, a couple of recommendations I think that flow from our conversation here. And I see some evidence of this, and I was in, I think it was Michigan recently. They're, as are many states, launching some efforts to really beef up literacy instruction. And one of the items on a list of considerations was early childhood experiences. I mean, it's not as pervasive as it needs to be. I mean, there's some reasons for this. Structurally, the state departments of education usually have early childhood someplace different than K-12, which is sealed off from literacy, and they're compartmentalized. In the federal government, for example, K-12, the Department of Education doesn't even handle Head Start. That's in Health and Human Services. So we create all sorts of, academia is not the only place where silos are created and people don't talk across them. In our bureaucracies and our organizations, we tend to organize ourselves in such ways that don't facilitate, cross chatter among people who need to be chatting with each other. So there's these structural limitations that we have to kind of work across. So certainly bringing in early childhood education, whether at the state level or at the federal level, to the extent that the federal government, has some influence on what goes on in the states, would be very important. So, I completely, wholeheartedly concur with that. The other thing I would say when we get to reading policy from K-12 or, early elementary, which is where kind of reading instruction begins, I think that state policies and legislation and Department of Education policies have got to be much more transparent in what they are requiring or at least advocating. And I think that a lot of times they make a mistake of using terms that are just too vague. I mentioned the problem with balanced literacy that is not now in common use what was meant 20 some years ago. And someone asked for a clarification, I'll provide that later. But we need to use words that actually mean something that we can agree on. Science of reading, unfortunately, has become this lightning rod. You say science of reading, and some people are militant advocates for science of reading, whatever they mean by it. And some people are hugely skeptical, saying it's only about phonics. So we have a lot of misunderstandings. And what happens, those misunderstandings get codified in state legislation and state policies and departments of education. So they talk about the science of reading. Programs should conform to what the science of reading has found. It'd be much more useful, I think, to talk about things that we can conclude from the science of reading. For example, that foundational skills are extremely important and have to be emphasized because, as I said, that's how you connect the oral language with the written language. They are non-negotiables that need to be prominently featured. But at the same time, it is very important that the real meaning of balanced literacy that the National Reading Panel talked about 23 years ago has got to be part of legislation as well. While you're working on those foundational skills, you've got to be working on vocabulary and background knowledge and all those other things in the language part of learning to read, because eventually those things have got to converge. So I think we have to be much more explicit about what our reading education should consist of, rather than invoking science of reading or the 5 pillars from the National Reading Panel, which I have no problem with, but they get implemented in the most superficial and non-informed way possible. And I think we just end up kind of running around in circles. So I think greater clarity based on what the findings of the science of reading are, rather than just labels that we flag around. I think that's absolutely essential if we're going to move ahead. More things are needed, but that's essential.
And Jim, before I go to you, I do want to call out one of the comments in the chat box, because Melissa Vasquez, she also attended the Reading League Summit, and she said her takeaways was that there are many aspects that apply, but there are nuances that we must emphasize when it comes to multilingual learners, like a heightened focus on oral language development, vocabulary development, ensuring that we lift and make visible cross-linguistic connections and use the home language, right? Which I think we all agree on that. But Jim, I'm going to ask you to comment on something, because based on what you said, Claude, there is some language that goes into policy that concerns me when it applies to multilingual learners. So for example, if people think that looking at pictures are bad, take all the pictures away. Pictures have a role in helping kids that are learning the language develop vocabulary, understanding, and put things into their lexicon in a second language. Jim, what is your caution when it comes to policies that may be misapplied, with even though there are good intentions?
When we look at policies, they've got to take account of all of the research. And in that diagram, what I tried to express was the fact that there needs to be a K-12, and I mean K-12, focus on language. We need to be consistently drawing students' attention to how language works. That'll include phonological awareness, it'll include phonics, it'll include morphological awareness, it'll include lexical issues. And there are huge potentials when we're talking about multilingual learners here. For example, if you take Spanish speakers and their learning of English, the overlap between the languages provide huge opportunities to exploit cognate use. If you look at a word like predict in science, which students who are learning science in grade 1, for example, will come across that word as an essential aspect of the process of scientific inquiry. The Spanish word is virtually identical. That root word comes from the Latin to say, and there's about 20 words in English and Spanish that have that root word, ranging from dictator to dictation to valedictorian to whatever. So when we look at that language awareness or knowledge about language aspect of the diagram, this is hugely important. And so with reference to what Claude was saying about the need to draw kids' attention directly to the connections between oral and written language, for sure we need to do that. And direct instruction, demystifying how language works, is something that should be going on, not just in the English language arts class, but in science class, in math class, across the curriculum. So I'm putting phonics instruction and foundational skills under a much broader umbrella that I think should be part of the mindset of teachers, that we take every opportunity to draw kids' attention to language. And bilingual kids have an additional advantage in doing that, and additional opportunities for teachers to draw attention across languages. But at the same time, if we look at where vocabulary development comes from, a lot of it comes from books. I've got a lot of ambivalence about the notion of oral vocabulary, because vocabulary knowledge is vocabulary knowledge. And kids get their vocabulary from listening to stories, from reading books. That's where you find lower frequency vocabulary items. And so if students are listening to read alouds for 5 years before they come to school, before they start reading instruction, they've got a huge amount of low frequency vocabulary that they've got from books. So the notion of oral vocabulary is something different from written vocabulary. I just don't buy it. We get our oral vocabulary largely from listening to books, or at least the oral vocabulary that's relevant to reading. So when it comes to policies, what I would like to see is policymakers who are looking at reading policy for a particular state or school district start off with a diagram like this and said, okay, this is the starting point. We need to make sure that kids' attention is being drawn to all aspects of how language works, right through right across the curriculum. But we also need to provide access to them for the opportunities to expand their vocabulary, to use language powerfully for a variety of purposes. And you get a lot of that from books and from talking about books and discussion about it. And that's knowledge building is part of that. So, you know, a lot of the dichotomies that are out there need to be brought together.
And
that's why,
if I may bring the two, if I may bring the two of you together, because as I listen to both of you, I think it is important because what Claude said is we are pre-wired for speaking, we are not pre-wired for reading, but language is the foundation of everything, right? But the bottom line is, I think, like, if you think that words become sight words through orthographic mapping, but orthographic mapping involves the formation of letter sound connections to bond spellings, pronunciations, and meanings of words. Sometimes I feel that people are talking about the sound to pronunciations, but they are leaving out the lexicon. And I think all three must come together for words to become sight words. And every word wants to be a sight word when it grows up, right?
Sure. Can I step in here? And
yes,
I'm going to get a little nerdy because you mentioned orthographic mapping. You went there. So
yes, I went there.
I'm going to follow you, Amelia, because it always works out when I follow you. So before I follow you, let me just make a point. You know, Jim's diagram, as helpful as it is, but notice that it confounds language and literacy, right? It's language/literacy. And I don't want to lose sight of the fact, we can come back to this because Jim might have a different perspective, which is okay. That's why we're here. But language and literacy divided, you know, suggests that you're talking about one and the same thing. I don't necessarily think Jim meant that, but that's what it infers. And I want to emphasize the difference between oral language and written language. They are distinct enough that we need to think about them differently. So let me just put a pin on that because I want to follow Amelia and maybe get back to that. You know, one of the most influential things I've ever read in my life, after Jean Shaw's Stages of Reading Development, I'll put in a plug for that, is an article by Linnea Airy, where she talked about an early intervention for emergent bilinguals. They technically were not English learners. You know, states have different criteria, and sometimes kids that classified or not as English learners for like totally random kind of things, but they were emergent bilinguals. They were predominantly Spanish-speaking kids from Spanish-speaking homes, and they were learning English as a second language, so they qualified as emergent bilinguals, which is kind of a fuzzier term. They were having trouble getting traction in early reading, in English. They were in an all-English program. So what she did was she took an intervention that had been demonstrated as, you know, successful, modestly positive effects, as these things tend to get, that worked for English-speaking students having difficulty in early reading. And so she took that intervention, added a very strong oral ELD, oral language component to it that really emphasized helping the kids learn the meaning of the words that were being used, the words and the text being used to teach foundational reading skills, whether it was phonemic awareness, letter sounds, beginning decoding, phonics, and so forth. She made it a point to make sure that kids understood that vocabulary, because think about it, kids who speak a language, when they're learning beginning literacy skills, typically they know the meanings of the words that are being used to teach them to read, to teach beginning decoding skills. Read, run, see, bat, cat. Those are words that are already in the lexicon of a child who already speaks English. For English learner, that's what they're called, English learner. They're learning the language. And that's one of the things that they need support on. So she had this program that was successful for English speakers, and she added that ELD component, and she made it just as successful for the emergent bilinguals who were having difficulty, and helped them get on track. Now, that's important in of itself, because it suggests that the kind of instruction that's needed for emergent bilinguals or ELs is very similar, if not identical, to what English speaking students need, with the proviso that they need ELD support so that they understand the words and the text that are being used to teach them reading skills. And she has a passage where she describes the program, where she says the whole purpose of the intervention was to provide the students with enough English language understanding of the words in the text so that they were encouraged, okay, this is very important, that the children were encouraged to use their phonics skills, their letter sound knowledge, their phonics skills to decode words when they first encountered them in their reading, to decode words, and then cross-check, to use the word cross-check, with pictures and meaning and context to verify that, yeah, this is a word I know and it makes sense in this context. Now, this is subtly but fundamentally important from balanced literacy, because it's not just choose this cue, choose that cue, and bring them all together. You use your decoding skills to make your first pass at recognizing a word, and then you ask yourself, do I know this word? And then does this word make sense? To your point, Amelia, you can't do, let me just finish this part, Jim.
Yeah.
You can't do that part if you don't know the meaning of the words, but you don't do it all at once. Recognizing the word comes after you first decode it, and then you say, yeah, this is a word I understand, and yes, it makes sense in that context. That's sort of the mental habit, if you pardon a behaviorist term, that you want to inculcate as children learn to read, whether they're English speakers or English learners. The English learners need the support so they can do that last part. Without that support in English language, they can't do that last part, and it's fundamental for them. That's the difference. Sorry, Jim, go ahead.
Just a kind of however to follow up your yes, but in Linnea Ayer's study, she basically is saying that focus on contextual cues is an important secondary way of checking meaning and expanding vocabulary. And my problem with the way in which the attack on 3 cueing is typically undertaken or rolled out as equivalent to balanced literacy is that it doesn't make a distinction between use of 3 cueing as a primary focus of decoding as opposed to a secondary. I totally agree that all kids need to have skills in identifying sound symbol relationships. They need to have phonics skills, and that should be the initial way in which they try to decode. But when you attack contextual cues and identify that as whole language, you're ignoring the fact that most of the people who are doing research in this area have identified attention to meaning, attention to pictures, attention to other contextual cues as a really important way of identifying words that where the phonics rules don't give us the access to the meaning. And so, you know, it's not a case of contextual cues bad, phonics good. We need to bring them together with the acknowledgement that attention to sound symbol relationships should be the first run through, but then with words that we can't decode properly or not sure of, or where there's the sound symbol relationships don't give us necessarily the meaning, we use secondary cues. And that's the basics. That's what Linnea Ayer was doing in that study. And so we can't just say contextual cues are bad. And that again comes down to the journalistic approach to this, where typically you'll find 3 cueing attacked as as guessing, and all of balanced literacy being reduced to just guessing. It's there's a lot of inaccuracies there. So
but Jim,
it's
So
if
wait,
we
wait.
could agree,
Let me
no, no.
let,
If
let
we
me
could agree, if we could agree on the definition that you gave, then we would be okay. But the problem is that definition is not clarified, and people confound this very, very subtle difference with just use all these cues. And in the literature, they use guessing. I mean, Lucy Calkins in her materials uses guessing. It's literally part of the framework in which they operate. And if we could be as subtle and as discreet as you are, we'd be okay. But, people get PTSD from words that have kind of been misused. Balanced is one of those things, and cues is one of those things that creates
yes.
PTSD. If we get past that, we might make some progress.
And that's
Sorry,
the reason
Amelia,
I want to
didn't mean to-
repeat. I want to repeat this because this is really important. And this is what we talk about when we say science of reading movement. There are nuances. So don't teach context as a primary. It's
Yes.
okay to use context as a secondary in order to confirm your primary strategy. And please, if you are not familiar with the work that is being done at the Florida Center for Reading Research for the past 5 years, they have been looking at set for variability and the importance of kids being flexible, as important as phonemic awareness. So if you are not aware of the work on set for variability and the role of flexibility in becoming proficient readers, please check that out. Now, so this is so exciting. Do you see how exciting this is? Like we only have 8 minutes left. This is just so sad. So I am going to ask you, because I really like this example of nuance and not get over your PTSD and dig deep. So that's the only way of bringing people together in order to benefit kids. But let's go there. Staying above the fray. The science of reading, like Rome, was not built in a day, but the importance of avoiding like one-liners, toxic dichotomies, single stories, spreading misinformation. Can you, and I'm going to start with you, Jim, can you give people a couple of examples of like, how do they stay above the fray, stay informed on behalf of children?
The intention that I had in putting that little diagram together, the simple view of the science of reading instruction, was to get to a point where we can talk about nuances. There's nothing particularly nuanced about that diagram. There's 3 components in there, and 2 of them have been largely ignored in the debate on science of reading and reading instruction. There's minimal focus in many of the journalistic articles. There's not much focus in many of the policies on maximizing students' exposure to print, focusing on getting kids engaged, focusing on making sure we have good libraries in schools, focusing on having books to send home for kids to read with their parents. None of that is making its way into the policy. And that's all part of that literacy engagement aspect. And it's all part of what should be happening at a preschool level also. So if we can get to a stage where this big picture is agreed upon, and is a starting point for policymakers to talk about what kind of policies do we need, we will have a very different implementation of science of reading that will actually be much more reflective of what the research is actually saying.
Jim, Claude, give us a couple of examples.
Well, again, at the risk of repeating myself and repeating Jim, I think the early childhood and point is very, very valid and needs to be taken seriously. Amelia, your prompt was, how do you stay above the fray? How do you stay informed? This is a good but difficult question, because teachers, how can I say this? Teachers are very busy. They've had a lot to do. Newsflash. And they rely on who they think are authoritative voices to provide guidance, to provide insight, to provide professional development. And when people make claims, they're not going to run like you and Jim and I can do to our university libraries and pull down those articles. They're not going to do it. And it's wrong to expect them to do that. They don't have the training, they don't have the time. So they really rely on us to provide them with accurate information. And if we don't provide accurate information, and I gave one example, I can give several examples of misinformation that is making the rounds. I mean, one that just drives me crazy is the thing about bilingual brain. And there are people saying that there's a bilingual brain, and you got to teach kids with bilingual brains in a fundamentally different way. That is untrue. There is no evidence of that. Yet people think it's true. Yeah, there's a bilingual brain. I'm bilingual. Jim's bilingual. Amelia, you're bilingual. So by definition, we have bilingual brains. But that doesn't mean that we have to be taught literacy in a different way. The only real difference is if you're being taught to read in a language you don't know, you got to provide that language support. But when people who have authority and are at universities and have loud voices say there's a bilingual brain and therefore we need to teach in a fundamentally different way, that is a piece of misinformation that just muddles the water. So I want to, again, urge colleagues, people who have positions of responsibility, they've got to be responsible. They have to know the research. They have to know what the findings are that are outside their own particular point of reference, their own experience. That's why we do research, because you don't know everything from direct experience. So in order to help teachers stay above the fray and stay informed, we have to provide them with accurate information. That is the message I want to give out.
Thank you. And I will leave you with two recommendations. The first one is, if you do not follow Tim Shanahan's blog, Shanahan on Literacy, it is a very good way to get the gist of the research if you don't have time to read it yourself. The second piece that I want to bring up is there's a role, an important role that journalists play. They call attention to an issue. They report on an issue, but it's different than researchers and the breadth of research. So take it for what it is. What is the role of a journalist? What is the role of a researcher? And get what you need from both areas, but don't mix the two, right? I think that's really, really important. Of course, we're not done. We're going to have to come back next year and continue this. I want to thank you very much for your presence. And I also want to let you know that next month, we are going to have Dr. Pedro Nogueira and Dr. Irvin Scott speak to users that are implementing the science of reading using a high-quality curriculum in monolingual and in dual language settings. Look out for your follow-up email. We are going to send you information so you can register for that. And we will continue this conversation next year. I want to thank both Claude and Jim so much for what you have done, what you have modeled. And remember, we are not done. This is an ongoing conversation. Good luck, guys. Thank you.
Thank you, Amelia. Thank you very much.
Thanks,
And
Amelia.
to you, Jim.
Thanks, Claude.